President Trump has called for recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the disputed region known as the Golan Heights. Here's President Trump's full tweet. After 52 years, it is time for the United States to fully recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is of critical strategic and security importance to the state of Israel and regional stability. The statement comes as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is visiting Israel. And here's what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Secretary Pompeo had to say about this news.
President Trump has just made history. I called him. I thanked him on behalf of the people of Israel. He did it again. First, he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moved the U.S. Embassy here. Then he pulled out of the disastrous Iran treaty and reimposed sanctions. But now he did something of equal historic importance. He recognized Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And he did so at a time when Iran is trying to use Syria as a platform to attack and destroy Israel. And the message that President Trump has given the world is that America stands by Israel.
All right, let's bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Dan Raviv. He has been following the story since it broke. Dan, let's focus on what the president said to start off with. He said that it was time for action, but it wasn't clear that his statement constituted official recognition. What is the official process here? What needs to happen? Does he need congressional approval?
No, he actually does not. After all, he's the chief executive, and the president of the United States can decide things like this. You see, the United States recognized the state of Israel when it was created in May of 1948, and the U.S. doesn't say what the borders are, but there are a lot of policies. For instance, after the Six-Day War in 1967, the United States didn't let its officials and diplomats visit the West Bank, captured from Jordan, the Gaza Strip, captured from Egypt, the Golan Heights, captured from Syria, not without special permission. It was not considered part of Israeli territory. Now, little by little, some of those things have changed, and right now it's a total change. So we do expect President Trump to issue orders, probably through the State Department, to change all the procedures, and even official U.S. maps are likely to change to show the Golan Heights not as disputed territory held by Israel, but as part of the state of Israel. Michelle?
Dan, you can't help but notice the timing of this decision, less than 3 weeks before the elections in Israel. Was the president cognizant of that? Was that perhaps part of the calculation when announcing this today, or via tweet?
In a TV interview that will air tomorrow, President Trump says he wasn't even aware of the Israeli election and its timing. He added that he understands Netanyahu is doing pretty well in the campaign, but suggested that that's not what it was about, even though Middle East pundits assume that that's mainly what President Trump wanted to do, to help Netanyahu in the election campaign. I have to say that when it comes to Secretary of State Pompeo, as you reported, he is in Israel. He and his wife enjoyed visits to the holy sites, both Christian and Jewish, and he also spoke about the decision by his boss, the president. Let's watch.
Tonight, President Trump made the decision to recognize that hard-fought real estate, that important place, is proper to be a sovereign part of the state of Israel. President Trump made a bold decision to recognize that, an important decision for the people of Israel. It will truly be historic. And the people of Israel should know that the battles they fought, the lives that they lost on that very ground, were worthy.
And Pompeo, who was a U.S. Army officer, when he was at West Point as a cadet, he says he studied the tank battles in which the Israelis defeated the Syrians to capture the Golan Heights in '67 and the battles of 1973. Michelle?
Dan, could any of this have been possible, this and the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, without the de facto peace, if you will, and cooperation that Israel now has with Saudi Arabia?
I'm going to say yes, again, because it was totally up to Donald Trump, and he intended from the very beginning when it came to the Middle East to be different from all previous presidents. He didn't understand why they didn't recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and so he decided to do that, to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, here again acting on something that he actually said today that other presidents didn't do it, but I'm getting it done. I don't think it had to do with Saudi Arabia or any other country. It had to do with Donald Trump wanting to be different, and he would say a realist about all this. Michelle?
Dan, thank you so much. Dan Raviv. All right, let's talk more about this big move with Matthew Brodsky. He's a Middle East and geopolitical analyst at Wikistrat. And Major Mike Lyons from the Modern War Institute. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. And Matthew, let's start with you. Give us a sense broadly of how significant this recognition of Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights is.
I think it's significant given the context in which about a week ago you've had Netanyahu explain that he has seen the new cell of Hezbollah now entrenching itself on its doorstep on the Syrian side of the Golan, and that Iran's entrenchment enterprise throughout Syria is going on unabated. So I think it helps address Israel's security concerns. Another aspect is that it really puts a thorn in the side of Russia, because Russia has been hoping to use a peace process between Assad and hopefully Israel over the Golan Heights. And that would, of course, legitimize Assad. Just the process itself would. And, of course, Putin doesn't care about the peace, but he would, of course, emerge as a much greater regional arbiter. This takes that entire situation or possibility pretty much off the table. So it shrinks what Russia is able to do. It also sends a message that you can't have half a century of this type of behavior from a Syrian leader and expect to be rewarded.
And that has certainly been a point stressed by some like the likes of Lindsey Graham. Mike, explain why this is so strategically important for Israel from a military perspective.
Well, the Golan Heights is key terrain. I actually studied at West Point the same time the Secretary of State did, and I could tell you we went over this terrain extensively, and the battles that took place there and the lives that were lost there. They were tremendous Israeli military victories. They were outgunned, undermanned in all cases, but they used technology and better tanks in order to defeat that. So there's no way the Israeli government is going to give up this key terrain in terms of its location. They call them the heights for a reason. It's the high ground of that whole area, that if an enemy was going to come in to attack Israel, that's the channel they would come down and through. Israeli forces have defended it, took it over, then defended it ferociously during the 73 war. So from the military perspective, there's just no way they're giving that up.
And we will continue this discussion. Mike and Matt, stay right there, including more on the story and more on the history of the Golan region from the political and military angles, and the once floated deal by a former Israeli prime minister to give up control of the Golan. And there were more groundbreaking moments in Israel today, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's visit to the Western Wall. We have the details. And it was still a day of violence in the West Bank. We'll have the latest on
the alliances, surprising and controversial. The Israeli Prime Minister fights for a record 5th term. Stay up to date on daily events only on I-24 News.
You're watching ClearCut. Welcome back. I'm MIchelle Makori. And once again, our top story, President Trump's announcement that the U.S. will recognize Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights. Now, let's just take a closer look now at exactly what and where we're talking about. The Golan Heights is a mountainous region separating northern Israel and Syria. It had been in Syrian hands until 1967. That's when the Israeli army took the territory from an invading Syrian army in the Six-Day War. International law usually dictates that land taken from aggressor nations in war can be kept by the country that was attacked. Now, although Syria attacked Israel here, the Golan has still remained disputed territory since 1967. Now, in 1994, the Israeli government, under then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, floated the idea of pulling out of at least some of the Golan in return for a peace deal with Syria. Syria never accepted that offer. But the Israeli public and much of the pro-Israel community in the U.S. also reacted strongly against the idea. This bumper sticker, which in Hebrew calls for Israel keeping the Golan, became a very frequent sight on Israeli and even many American roads. All right, let's rejoin our panel and discuss this further with Matthew Brodsky with Wikistrat and Major Mike Lyons from the Modern War Institute. Matthew, I want to focus on the timing because there are clearly several political angles to this move. Firstly, this comes less than 3 weeks before Israeli elections, and this is seen by many as a big boost to Prime Minister Netanyahu. When the president was asked about that during an interview with Fox's Maria Bartiromo, here's what he had to say.
I've been thinking about doing it for a long time. It's been a very hard decision for every president. No president has done it.
It's not about Netanyahu's reelection.
No, I wouldn't even know about that. I wouldn't even know about that. I have no idea. I hear he's doing okay. I don't know if he's doing great right now, but I hear he's doing okay. But I would imagine the other side, whoever's against him, is also in favor of what I just did. Every president has said, do that. I'm the one that gets it done.
Matthew, do you think that this move was intended to boost Netanyahu?
I think it certainly does, whether it was designed to do that or not. I think the president, though, absolutely wants Netanyahu to be reelected. He has a very close personal relationship with him, and President Trump puts a lot into personal relationships. I think it's also interesting that the way President Trump said that past presidents have been speaking about doing this, I don't really think the past presidents have been doing it, but I think this actually just bolsters the Jewish vote in the wake of Ilhan Omar's past anti-Semitic comments to just try to get Jewish Americans to vote for Republicans here in the United States, and at the same time puts another arrow in Netanyahu's quiver as he gets down toward the April 9th election.
Well, Matthew, do Israeli voters credit Netanyahu's relationship with the president for this, or do they think that the president would have taken this move regardless of who's the prime minister of Israel?
Right. I think that this move may have been coming no matter what. I think the timing is not coincidental, as you had said, but the push from Netanyahu to have this area recognized started at the very beginning of the Trump administration, and the push only intensified over time. So here we are.
Mike, as we mentioned, the timing politically is, of course, significant on a number of levels, domestically in the United States, as well as what's happening in Israel. Tell us about the timing, though, in terms of where Syria is with regards to the civil war, because it does seem to have now consolidated most of its hold over Syria. And there was some concern that Assad, as he's been threatening to do, may now make a push for the Golan Heights. Is that part of the reasoning? How does this factor in?
Well, I think actually Syria is in its most weakened state it's been in the last 8 years. It's just recently has ISIS now off its borders in the east, and the government still does not even control certain areas. So this happening, giving Israel this sovereignty and this power now, it gives them really the upper hand. The Syrian government does not have a lot of military force, which is the only way they're going to be able to eject them if they wanted to do it forcefully. And Israel has got concerns about Russia and the Iranians, for example, to come in, put military assets there, listening posts, but more or less the heights of the mountainous regions that are there would provide a tremendous high ground that would allow Israel's enemies to fire rockets and all kinds of artillery inside of Israel.
And, Mike, this comes as there are new threats from Iran and Hezbollah. The Prime Minister stressing how Israel discovered a new Hezbollah terror cell on the Syrian Golan Heights, that they've discovered missile factories in Syria. Matt mentioned the aspect of Russia. Does this move benefit the U.S. in some way in terms of keeping Russia in check as a power broker in the region? I
think we have to see. I think two issues. The first is whether or not the United States cleared this with our allies that we work with, NATO allies, for example. I think it could possibly weaken this argument that NATO has been saying that Russia has illegally occupied Crimea, and so how can we claim that Russia can't stay there, but we're letting Israel take the Golan Heights? I think that could be an argument.
I think on the international law, the argument argument would be that it's because Syria attacked Israel and it was a conquest in that sense. But I hear your point. In terms of recognition from other world leaders and from other countries, what reaction do you expect from the surrounding Arab countries?
Yeah, well, not only the Arab countries, allies there, but also Europe. How does Europe feel about this? I mean, you got to look at countries that have not moved their embassies to Jerusalem. You've got to see how other countries' relationship is with Israel. I think that's going to dictate as to what they're going to do and how they're going to feel about it. But again, this also could be just talk policy where nothing really happened. It's kind of like the president saying we were going to pull our troops out of Syria. We ended up keeping some there. It more or less just really empowers Israel so much more. The question is, what else does the United States do besides just sign a declaration saying Israel has the sovereign right over the Golan Heights? And
Matthew, I want to focus very quickly on Mike's point. How does the Trump administration make it official? We know that Congress has been pushing, well, some in Congress, Republican senators like Ted Cruz have been pushing to get legislation through recognizing the sovereignty. But what needs to happen officially, and do you see the Trump administration taking that step?
I think the legislation will be helpful, but again, President Trump can declare it, and that's part of his executive area of responsibility. Well, I mean, this is how he's unveiled much in the way of his policies over the past few years. So perhaps he'll write some official type of statement, but I think that begins to shift the Middle Eastern mythologies that Israel's neighbors have really lived under for decades, and that is another helpful aspect of this move.
Right. Perhaps it does shape the narrative, to your point, Matt, and set the trend, as we've seen with declaring Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Thank you so much, Mike Lyons and Matthew Brodsky. And again, all of this news just adds to the factors making this year's AIPAC conference likely the most watched gathering yet. And of course,